Welcome to another edition of Uncensored. Since October 7, when Hamas carried out deadly and brutal attack killing about 1,400 Israelis, the region is on boil. The events unfolding there continue to shape and reshape the region. It has put in jeopardy the normalcy which was witnessing between Israel and the Arab world, especially Saudi Arabia. In the centrality of all this crisis is Iran. The theocratic state there is itself facing existential crisis. And crisis is one thing which is steering at this part of the region. To understand what are the real objectives of Iran, what is its long and short-term game plans, and its modus operandi. We're very fortunate to have been joined with Dr. Kamran Bokhari from New York. Dr. Kamran is a senior director of the Eurasian Security and Prosperity Portfolio of the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. He has also served at the US State Department and also at the World Bank. Dr. Kamran has been witnessing Iran for quite a long time and is considered an authority on the region. Dr. Kamran, welcome to our show and thanks a lot for sparing your time.
Thank you for having me, Tarun.
How are you doing? I know you have been quite busy for since October, I believe.
Yeah, no, I was teaching a course last fall at the University of Delaware titled Geopolitics of the Middle East. It was an undergraduate upper division course. And when I started in late August, I did not know there would be a war. And then, in October, the war began and it essentially metastasized into a regional conflict. So it was an interesting semester teaching that and then trying to make sense of the reality, parallel. So you're trying to make sense of what's going on and relay that to the students. So that was a bit challenging.
Yeah, I understand. So, Kamran, as we discussed earlier, we will discuss Iran. So, my first question to you, I mean, a theory is going around that Iran itself was caught off guard by this kind of attack. I mean, it's the people are saying that Iran itself didn't know. But if we look at in the background of the meeting in Beirut, which was attended by revolutionary guards, Houthis, Hamas, Syrian militia leaders from the Iraq, do you still believe that Iran was caught off guard by this kind of attack by Hamas?
Absolutely not, because as I've been saying in many podcasts and in my writings and in my media interviews since October 7th, that the Iranians are not surprised. In fact, I've been arguing against U.S. media reports that which reference intelligence sources saying that the evidence suggests that the leadership of Iran was surprised. But I don't buy that because, look, this is a need to know basis. These kind of operations are planned. And, in any country, this is not just Iran. If any country is involved in, clandestine activities of any sort, here we're talking about terrorism, Iran supporting terrorist groups. But the reality is these are things that are on a need to know basis. Even the leadership of a country is not, up to date, if you will, beyond a certain superficial level. And then also, we have to ask this question: who amongst the leadership knew and who expressed surprise? So obviously, there are going to be surprises for many people in the leadership of Iran because they're not privy to that kind of knowledge. It's kept within a tight circle, and we can go into the details if you like. But the bottom line is, I don't think the Iranians were surprised. Now, would they have been surprised at the scale at which Hamas was able to attack? Most likely, because when you plan something, it's one thing, and then when it's being executed, it's something. So sometimes there are disappointments, sometimes there are surprises, and I think in this case it was catastrophic success for the Iranians because then they had to deal with a new situation that emerged out of the attacks in terms of the if you will, a very strong response by the Israelis that since then has led to the deaths of 30,000 Palestinian civilians in Gaza, including women and children, and it still continues. So the Iranians may have been surprised at this outcome, but they knew it was coming.
They knew it was coming, and I mean, the two factors which you highlighted is it was the success was itself. I mean, was it quite surprise both for the Iran and the Hamas, and also the response of the Israel was also a surprise for them because till now 20,000 people have died and the operations continue there. But I just want to understand from you, even if we can go into the details as you have been highlighting that okay, the top leadership may not be knowing exactly what is the game plan, but this was planned and executed to a certain extent by the Iran. So, what was the Iran's basic objective? Was it to put Palestine issue on the forefront and for, if this was to happen, then put Israel on the back foot? Was it its game plan?
And that's a great question, Tarun, and it's something that is not really addressed in the detail that it requires. I've been trying on my end to sort of explain the strategic intent behind the Iranians supporting and engineering this attack. Look, it's not to put the Palestinian issue on the forefront. There are many who will make that argument, but they assume that Iran cares deeply about the Palestinian people. I'm not saying they don't care, but any state actor, what's in it for them? And if that's the case, then they would just be focusing on the Palestinian issue. But we know they've been supporting the Houthis. I mean, I think one of the biggest developments from the war in Gaza is the rise of Houthi capability to interdict international commercial traffic in the Red Sea shipping lanes. So why is Iran doing that? And then we know that there's support for either they're supporting the militias in Syria that are propping up the Assad regime. And then there are those who are next door in Iraq. So this is all part of a strategic plan. If I had to put it succinctly, look, the Iranians know that the United States it is really its bandwidth is stretched between all across Eurasia, from Russia to China. There are all sorts of things happening, and then there's the domestic commotion within the United States. It's an election year, and even if it wasn't an election year, we're seeing political polarization. So there's a lot on Washington's plate, and then you have the reality of the Arab world, which is the majority of the Middle East. It is weak. It is dependent on the United States. The US support is not what it used to be. The region has become far more complicated. There are many, many more fault lines than even when they were, let's say 2011 happened. So the Iranians see this as an opportunity to exploit. If there's more chaos in the region, they're able to exploit the situation to their advantage. And I must note that right now, Iran is on the offensive. Iran is driving events in the Middle East. Everyone else is reacting. Now, the peer power to Iran is Turkey. But Turkey, as you see, is neither here nor there. It's incapable of even reacting in a meaningful way to what Iran is doing. As I mentioned, the Arab states are weak. Israel sees itself strategically being surrounded, and it's reacting, we see that in Gaza. We see that in Lebanon. And there is this hot war, almost a hot war going on, although it's not direct, between Iran and Israel. So I think the strategic intent is empire building. The days of being able to conquer territories are long gone. But Iran's influence in the Middle East, it hasn't had this level of influence in the Middle East, I would say, going back, even before Islam began, back to the Sassanid Empire. Obviously, the Sassanids control territory. The Islamic Republic of Iran does not. But if we sort of look at just from the angle of spheres of influence, the Iranians have, a lot of sphere of influence all across, not just from their border all the way to the contiguous belt to the Eastern Mediterranean, but a massive outpost on the Arabian Peninsula, on the southern tip in the form of Houthi-controlled Yemen. And with the situation deteriorating and with pressure piling on the Arab states, on the US, on Israel, and even Turkey, where is that pressure coming from? Iranian instigated, realities.
I mean, that's a great take you have got. That's an important thing. Also, just which you have read, that Iran is now at its peak of strength as far as the empire building is concerned. It's the beginning of Islam. But that also requires quite a bit weakening of the US, and which is it, and Iran wants to eject US out of this region. So how the US is reacting to it? I mean, I haven't seen a very strong statement from the Biden that Iran will pay for its action. Is US wary about certain things? It doesn't want to enter into conflict at a or a full war, or it has its own calculus of the region.
I think it's both, Tarun. I think it has its own calculus. And I also think that it's a situation. So if you're sitting in Washington, the Middle East isn't the only thing happening, on an order of scale in terms of significance. The most significant issue, and they tend to compete with each other, is now sort of the Russians gaining the upper hand in Ukraine because of weakening American support. There is decreasing appetite in the United States to continue to support the Ukrainian military, which means that Russia is going to begin to make gains, which we're seeing, albeit it's still very, limited. But if this trend continues, we're looking at, the Russians perhaps expanding even further. That potential is there. I'm not forecasting that, but I'm saying that potential is there. So that's worrying the United States. You have, China. It's between challenging the United States and between its own inherent economic weakness. We're seeing a slide in the Chinese economy and this is the second largest economy of the world. And if the Chinese economy goes down, on one hand, the strategic challenge for the United States is reduced, but at the same time, it could have massive global implications, which will also affect the United States. These are the two things that are far more significant in terms of priority. Now, when you're stretched that far, far and wide, then how much time can you spend on the Middle East? And then, of course, there's a spike. When more people get killed, there's domestic pressure. We just saw in Michigan, somewhere around 131,000 people voted uncommitted in the Democratic primary, sending a very strong message to President Biden that if you, do not lead this country and force a ceasefire, use your influence with Israel to get a ceasefire, we may not vote for you come November. And this is very, very critical for Biden because the last time around, and it looks like it's going to be a rematch between Trump and Biden, and therefore, in last time around, he won by, I would say, I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I'm thinking roughly around in the 10,000 mark. That many votes. That's not a whole lot of votes. If you have 131,000 people saying we may not vote for you, then that means Michigan will go to Trump. And Biden is also, seen his popularity has decreased. It's not 2020. This is 2024. Things have changed. And so he's under a lot of pressure. So when there's pressure, you do come in. Now, as for the strategy for Iran, I don't think the United States has a strategy for Iran because it requires a level of attention that Washington is just not able to give. So it's basically holding the line through tried and tested tools, which is the use of airstrikes, intelligence-driven operations to contain the Houthi ability to interdict shipping, to contain the attacks from Shia militias in Iraq, to contain to not have a war between Hezbollah and Israel. I mean, if you notice, just a few days ago, CNN had a report which was, obviously a leak from the Biden administration, saying that the diplomacy isn't working in terms of preventing a Hezbollah Israel war, and it could be that in a few months we may see Israel, the IDF, essentially go head to head with Hezbollah forces in southern Lebanon. So why is the United States doing that? Is because it doesn't have a strategy. The point is the United States is trying to hold the line, whereas and that's hard. That is very hard for a power that's distant, not indigenous to the region, and then the fault lines within the region. There are differences amongst the Arab states as to what needs to be done. They're under pressure because of the deaths of 30,000 plus Palestinians in Gaza, that they want to see some progress towards a Palestinian state. You have the Biden administration doing, sending that message out as well, that in a few months' time, we are planning to, or we could recognize in principle the state of Palestine. That would be huge for Washington. So all these things show that the United States is just trying to manage the situation and does not have a strategy.
I mean, you rightly said that. I mean, US is just trying to manage the situation, hold the line, and it doesn't have a clear strategy how to go ahead of this in this region. But you pointed about the protests in the Michigan and all the large scale protests which happened across the world in support of the Palestine. What is happening there is horrendous. But the point which you highlighted in your earlier podcast, and which I also believe, is that conflict and occupation was always there. It is not something new. This war has been brought by the Hamas. Hamas is a sole actor responsible for this. But the way these things have panned out across the world, putting pressure, protests, protests even in support of the Houthis and Yemeni people. I have heard some kind of slogans out there. So this plays as an advantage for the Iran, and they are also using social media in a very nuanced manner to build the pressure on the US. So all these factors are playing in the hands of Iran, and it further pressurizes not just the US, but then it could put an existential threat to Israel itself.
So I don't think there's an existential threat to Israel because there are limits to what Iran and its proxies can do. I think that Israel has a serious problem. And it's multifaceted. Number one is that in a very unprecedented way, it is facing global backlash to the war in Gaza, and that pressure is mounting. And you now see it in the way in which even the Western press is discussing Israel. So there is that pressure. Then you have a government in Israel that is the most far right, the most extremist in terms of its composition. And it's very unpopular. And it's not unpopular because of just post October 7th. People don't remember or tend to forget in sort of the heat of the moment post October 7th that prior to October 7th, we had massive protests in Israel against this government, Netanyahu-led government, that wanted to undermine democracy, undermine the Supreme Court, and establish sort of a right-wing dominated state that basically undercuts the rule of law. So, and now, the latest figures suggest that Netanyahu's approval ratings are 15% at best. That's pretty bad. So that is another challenge. How do we? And meanwhile, the war goes on. Meanwhile, the tensions with Hezbollah are still there. We don't. The Israelis don't know what the Iranians are thinking. The Iranians don't know what the Israelis are planning. So it is a game of perceptions and misperceptions. So there's a lot of pressure on Israel, but I don't think that we can say that this is an existential issue. I think that it's an inflection point in the history of Israel where it will have to course correct, and that course correction will not happen in the short or the medium term. It will be a long drawn out process. The United States keeps talking about the need to go from the current situation to a Palestinian state, having a roadmap. Obviously, that roadmap is going to be very, very long because there needs to be, there are two large factions. Both of them have been weakened, Hamas and Fatah. So there isn't what the Secretary Blinken keeps talking about as unity of governance as a goal. So getting unity of governance on the Palestinian side is a huge issue. Then the issue of Jewish settlements in the West Bank. There are a lot of people who are homeless, facing starvation, and this is sort of the worst situation in terms of people being internally displaced, at least that I've seen in sort of my lifetime, because it's an active battle space. And it's not like, okay, you have IDPs. We saw IDPs, say, in Pakistan when the Pakistani military waged a counterinsurgency offensive in the northwest between 2009 and 16. But those people were largely taken care of. They were removed from the battle space. So in order to prevent deaths, obviously it was difficult for them, but there's no comparison. People are hungry. People are dying as they're searching for food. It's horrendous. And Egypt is alarmed by this because it's on their border, and Egypt is a country that's in dire straits financially. It cannot absorb a large influx of Palestinian refugees. So this is a very, very difficult situation for Israel. Meanwhile, from the Iranian point of view, as long as this chaos is there, it allows them to maneuver and extract geopolitical concessions from the United States. But I would also say, and we can get into this conversation later on, that Iran is going through an internal evolution as well. So while it is at its peak, if you will, in terms of establishing regional influence, a decades-long strategy on the part of this regime, the regime itself is not only at war with itself, but it's at an inflection point because you have the pending succession because you have an 84, 85-year-old supreme leader who's going to pass on. They just had elections for parliament and for the assembly of experts. So it's a very, very, it's an inflection point for the regime as to where this regime is going. So it's not as if Iran has an absolute upper hand. In relative terms, yes, but these situations are very tricky.
I mean, if Kamran, you gave an elaborative answer. I mean, inflection point both Israel is the inflection point both for the Israel and also for the Iran. But other factor is also that all the actors in this region are stretched out to the limit, both the US, the Israel, and the Iran. So the centrality of this crisis is the situation in Gaza. The US, you have said that US is thinking about recognizing Palestine as a separate sovereign state. It's a long drawn process, but they have said that we may start in this direction. Now, it's a very general and hypothetical kind of a question. Suppose this process starts running in, and Israel also give its consent. So let's move this forward, move in this direction. So that a semblance of normalcy returns in the region. But the regime in Iran, will it back up? Will it back down if the process steps in this direction, or it will find some other way to boil the crisis? I mean, I'm not quite sure. Even if this goes down, the regime in Israel will back up from what it is doing right now, especially with its axis of resistance, militias, and all that. Because, as you have said, Iran it is at its peak of strength as far as the empire is concerned.
So that's a great question, Tarun, that will it back off? But I think I would agree with you that, so before I say how I agree with you, let me point out that the Iranian MO, the modus operandi or strategy, is to exploit fault lines, different kinds of fault lines. Now, if you reduce those fault lines, then in theory, you reduce the room in which Iran can play. So if there is progress towards, we have a ceasefire, there's reconstruction, rehabilitation, and rebuilding of Gaza, movement towards, Palestinian self-determination. Again, it's not happening tomorrow, but if you have even those baby steps that are taken consistently, and they happen, and it's not going to be easy, because while a large number of people in Israel oppose Benjamin Netanyahu, they are also not in favor of a Palestinian state in the wake of everything that has happened. So not only are they traumatized by October 7th, but they also see the pressure building internationally against Israel. And so they feel vulnerable, and they think that this is the wrong time to concede a Palestinian state, because it could undermine their security. Rightfully or wrongfully, I don't want to get into the debate. As an analyst, I'm just trying to bring the perspective out, because then that will tell us how they will behave. So it will be difficult. But if there is progress, if you reduce the temperature of violence, if you will, even if you don't make a whole lot of progress to, beyond cessation of hostilities, and peace is, long drawn out, but as long as there is the absence of conflict, then you have the room for Iran to maneuver shrinks. But as you carefully, I would agree with you that there is no shortage of crises, fault lines that Iran will then try to exploit. So, for example, if there is, and hopefully it doesn't happen, but if there's a war between Hezbollah and Israel, that is another point for the Iranians to exploit. And this is something that the United States knows very well, which is why the United States has this administration has tried to prevent that. And notice the focus isn't on Hezbollah. The focus is on the Houthis, because they're a more immediate threat. Hezbollah is sort of locked in. It is it sort of dominates the Lebanese state. It's present in large numbers in Syria, supporting the Assad regime. But it's also something that the Iranians want to maintain and not render vulnerable in this current conflict, because it's the ultimate insurance policy in a future hypothetical scenario where Israel directly goes after Iran. So that's the Iranian perspective, and therefore the Americans have also said, well, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So that's sort of the rough approach that Washington has had. But if the U.S. fails in that, and there is an outbreak of hostilities, which we can't say that it will happen or won't happen, then you have a good example of another fault line that the Iranians will be able to exploit. Meanwhile, I think we shouldn't while Hezbollah is there, but I think that we need to keep an eye on the Houthis. The Houthis are emerging as a powerful instrument in the hands of Iran. Obviously, the Houthis are not doing this for solidarity with Palestinians. Of course, that's the discourse, but it serves their interests domestically. They can consolidate their position in Yemen. They become more stronger. At least that's their calculus, which is the driving force behind all these attacks. But if this is a major challenge for the United States. How does the United States deal with this? We are now seeing or hearing reports about not just unmanned aerial vehicles, the drones that have struck in Saudi Arabia in the past, UAE, and they attack these commercial vessels in the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. But we're also hearing about unmanned submarines. So tech is playing a huge role in the hands of actors like Iran, and that has transferred this know-how and hardware to its proxies. So I think there will be no shortage of issues that the Iranians will continue to exploit, but at least this one can be, you can take this one off the battlefield. if we reach a ceasefire that is durable?
Kamran, I mean, you have made quite a number of important questions, and we can discuss it at length. But now we're coming at the fag end of our program. Is one last thing I just want to know from you. Uh, Iran will continue to gain advantage if there are fault lines in the region, which you have explained in quite detail. And the to reduce the fault lines, the issue of Palestinians has to be settled, or it seemed to be settling down to a certain extent, and the peace is durable. But in the last, I want to understand from you, 2024, this year is quite critical. There's quite possibility of government change in US, where US stay. If Trump comes to power, how the things will pan out? Then what you are highlighting, they can go into the backdrop and so because Trump is seen quite hard line as far as the Iran is concerned. And if we speak about Iran, that means the entire region will be in a turmoil. So what's your take?
Well, we have to understand that there is one thing that, yes, in the last administration of President Trump, the White House took a very hardline stance against Iran. We saw the nixing of the nuclear deal, the policy of maximum pressure leading to tensions, and then, of course, the U.S. Eliminated a top general, Qasem Soleimani, who heads the Quds force of the IRGC. So we saw all of that. But we also know that the the Trump White House, or the Trump thinking, if right now he's not in the White House, so we can talk about his thinking. His thinking revolves around the idea that the United States should not unnecessarily get into wars, which we see playing out in the context of Ukraine. Well, why do we need to? I mean, so one of the problems that we have in the world today, and especially the United States, and it's sort of the unintended consequences of free speech environment plus free media, and you have a politicization of the discussion of policy. So the Democrats will say, "Oh, you have a soft spot for Putin. This is why you don't want to give weapons to Ukraine," and then the right in the United States respond. So it's a back and forth. But if we pull ourselves out of that, what we do know is that, and Trump has shown that by his behavior. He withdrew from Afghanistan. He was the one. His government did a deal with the most extreme Islamist group called the Taliban. So we know that. We know he met with Kim Jong-un, in an effort to calm things down with North Korea. He tried to do certain things with China. But I think that from what I'm hearing is that if there is to be a second Trump term, the focus will be geoeconomic and not military. That's my understanding. And I think that we don't want, I don't think the Trump administration is looking to pick a fight with Iran. It's not going to be engaged in diplomacy in the way that the Biden White House and the Obama White House did it, but it's not going to flip the pendulum to the other end, where it's going to be war and conflict. I think a lot depends upon how the domestic politics plays out in the United States. We are not certain by any stretch of the imagination. It's a toss-up. At this point, we could see Biden returning to a second term or a Trump White House. It's very unclear. We don't know, and even far more murky is what happens to Iran. Not just because of the elections there, but does Iran see a succession in 2024? Will there be a new supreme leader? How does that change Iran's behavior? For your listeners and viewers, I do want to sort of give a heads up that I have a report coming out next month on what post-Khamenei Iran will look like in terms of its behavior and outlook. But these are the things that we need to know before we can say, how will the US and Iran deal with one another?
Kamran, we look forward to read your report, and I will recommend our readers also to keep watch on your report. Thanks a lot for sparing your time and giving your insight on what's happening in this part of the world. And we will come back to you in future also to understand from your great perspective. Thanks a lot, Kamran.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.